Okay, let's get with it. Chapter 11, Snakes. They met in Minerva Square 2 hours later. The weather had turned foul. It was very chilly, and dirty gray rain clouds were scudding across the sky. Flavius's teeth were chattering. He had drawn the hood of his cloak far down over his ears. Perhaps his shivers were due as much to the thought of Lucas as to the cold. Antonio showed them a small dagger he had concealed in the folds of his toga. "Just to be on the safe side," he remarked mysteriously. He then made a great show of hiding the weapon under his toga again. "You act as though Lucas were dangerous," Julius said nervously. "He might try to put a spell on us after all," Antonio said. "Well, in that case, your dagger won't be any help," Julius replied. "A dagger always comes in handy," Antonio insisted. "Odysseus put out the Cyclops' eye with one." "That was a sharpened stake," Julius said. "We might take along a stake then," Antonius offered. Mucius urged them to get moving. "We must be back home before the doors are locked for the night," he reminded them. "Have you any money with you?" Julius asked. "Why?" Mucius was taken aback. "Lucas won't prophesy for nothing. I haven't a single copper with me." Antonius and Plubius were also That's kind of hard to say. Antonius and Plubius were also penniless. Mucius was furious. "We should have thought of that before," he reproached the others. "All I have is my regular pocket money, 35 sesterces. That's all I own." "It'll cost more than that, but maybe we can owe him the rest," Flavius suggested. "Or we can tell him to send the bill to Livia," Julius said. "No," Mucius said. "Lucas won't use his second sight unless he sees money right under his nose. We can't waste time either because Rufus has to be rescued as soon as possible. Who knows what he might be going through right now?" "It's horrible in prison," Antonio said. "They chain the prisoners up and give them only bread and water. Rats run over their faces, and they're beaten too. I once passed by the prison and heard some awful screams." "How much money do you fellows have at home?" Mucius asked firmly. That was an embarrassing question. "Not much," Plubius murmured. "I have a gold piece my uncle gave me for my birthday," Flavius admitted. Pleased, Mucius patted him on the back. "Fine," he said. "That's 100 sesterces already. What about you?" he asked Julius. "I've saved a little," Julius stammered. "I wanted to buy the collected works of Julius Caesar. They cost 300 sesterces. I've saved up 200 already." "Then you'll have to donate 100 of them," Mucius decided generously. Julius sighed in resignation. "I can borrow something from our cook," Antonio said quickly. "We have a famous cook who comes from Gaul. My father paid a fortune for him." "Run and get the money," Mucius ordered them. "I'll wait here for you." Flavius, Julius, and Plubius returned in short order. Julius brought his 100 sesterces, Flavius his valuable gold piece, and Plubius a heap of small copper coins. Antonius arrived a little while later and with a long face. His cook had proved to be a disappointment. "What a skinflint," he complained. "He wouldn't give me anything at all. Says he doesn't have any money, but I fixed him." He held up a round cheese, broke it into pieces, and offered a piece to each of them. "I don't want cheese. I want money," Mucius said. "I have some money too," Antonius replied. "I asked my father for an advance on my allowance. He happened to be home and was in a good mood on account of Praetonius's victory over the Gauls. 'Here's 50 sesterces for you,' he said, 'as generous as Jupiter in person. Buy yourself figs and honey. You know what? For this money, we could get a whole barrel full of figs.' 'This money doesn't go on food,' Mucius said, taking the coins. He gathered all their contributions and wrapped the coins in a clean handkerchief. 'We now have 297 sesterces. That ought to be enough. After all he has to do is look at the chain and tell us who the burglar is. That should not cost too much.' They set off, and half an hour later turned into Broad Street. The closer they came to Lucas's house, the deeper grew the silence among them, like a patrol nearing enemy lines. When they reached the big door, which they had often stared at, with such curiosity, they stood indecisively for a while. Across the street was their school, and they regarded it almost with affection. "I hope Xanthippus doesn't see us," Flavius said. "He's lying in bed and groaning over his leg," Publius said. "Don't you think we ought to do something about getting in?" Julius proposed. Mucius nodded agreement. "I'll knock," he said, and began drumming his forefinger against the door. When nothing happened, he knocked again. Still, nothing stirred, and Publius began pounding his fist against the door. Finally, Julius and Antonius took part, kicking vigorously with their sandals against the thick wood. When all this had no effect, Mucius tried the latch, and the door opened. It had not been locked at all. A few feet above it, however, was another door. This was bound with strips of iron, and had neither lock nor latch. Halfway up the door was a square pane of yellow glass, and the boys peered curiously through. Each in turn staggered back in terror. Behind the pane of glass, a frightful, grimacing face, illuminated by a greenish light, was staring at them. "That's Leucos," Flavius gasped. They waited anxiously for a while, but nothing stirred. Finally, Mucius peered through the glass once more and said, "It isn't Leucos. It's only a mask." "What a horrible mug," Julius said. "What's the idea?" "It's supposed to scare away evil spirits," Antonius said. "It could scare away even the good ones," Publius grumbled. "Here's a ring beside the door," Antonius noticed. "It must be there for a reason." "Pull on it," Mucius suggested. When Antonius pulled the ring, there sounded from somewhere deep inside the building a quivering bell tone, like a sigh from the world of shades. "What a gruesome noise," Julius murmured. Suddenly, the door flew open without a sound, as though moved by ghostly hands. The boys stared, but there was no one in sight. "He opened it by magic," Antonius whispered. Before them stretched a long, dark corridor. Back of the yellow pane of glass in the door hung a wooden box, to which the mask was fixed. It was lighted by a small oil lamp with a green shade. "Clever that," Julius whispered. "What do we do now?" Publius asked. "We'd best stay here at the door," Flavius recommended. "I see a curtain back there," Mucius said. They walked slowly down the corridor as far as the curtain and then hesitated in front of it. There was a faint, moldy smell. "Well, what are you waiting for?" A hoarse, unfriendly voice called out abruptly. "Come in." The boys started in fright, but automatically obeyed. Mucius pushed the curtain aside and went right in. The others followed him uneasily. They found themselves in a large, vaulted room, only dimly illuminated by a flickering fire in a fireplace. The bare walls glistened damply and were completely windowless. All around stood high columns, their tops lost in deep shadows. From each column hung a grinning mask, as ugly as the one behind the front door, and all the masks were illuminated from within, so that they looked like so many horrid ghosts. The soothsayer sat behind a large table with his back to the fireplace, and stared at the boys in silence. He looked even eerier than they had imagined him. Long, dirty yellow hair fell in tangled strands down to his shoulders, and over his forehead, as far as his eyes and his face, was strangely painted. The upper part of it was white. From his mouth down, it was painted black, so that the top of his face seemed to be detached from his body. He wore a long black cloak embroidered with silver stars, and in his right hand he held a ball of polished metal which reflected the glow of the fire. "Come closer," Lucas said, hoarsely, lisping. The boys edged up to the table, which was heaped with writing tablets and yellowed parchments. Their eyes fell on a sharp, short sword, which filled them with distrust. But they were disturbed most by a basket filled with writhing snakes. Leucos scrutinized the boys with small, cunning eyes, which seemed to them somehow full of hatred. "What do you want?" he asked. Mucius hastily thrust the chain into Julius's hand. You talk better than the rest of us, he whispered. You speak to him. Taken by surprise, Julius laid the chain on the table. He kept a respectful distance from the snakes. Good day, he said politely. We hoped you could tell us who this chain belongs to. There was a burglary at the home of our teacher, Xantippus, and we would like to know who the burglar is because Rufus has been arrested. You see, we are Rufus's friends, but he is innocent, and that is why we have come to you. We have heard that you know everything, so perhaps you can help us. Julius fell silent and gazed hopefully at Lucas. But his speech seemed to have made no impression. The soothsayer stared intently at this chain and did not say a word. The boys did not know whether he had gone into a trance or just fallen asleep with his eyes open. Julius cleared his throat. We have an idea the chain belongs to the burglar, so we would like to know what his name is and where he lives. That should not be a hard job for you, should it? Still, Lucas did not reply. He closed his eyes and remained silent and unmoving. It was uncannily still in the room. The boys could hear nothing but the low crackling of the burning sticks of wood in the fireplace. Maybe he wants his money first, Publius whispered. Julius summoned up his courage once more. We will pay, of course, he said to Lucas. What will it cost for you to use your second sight for us? We have money with us. The effect of these words was startling. Lucas sprang to his feet. He was much taller than the boys had imagined, at least a head taller than Publius, who was lanky and big for his age. Pounding the metal ball on the table, the soothsayer thundered, Get out! The boys were stunned. Get out of here, you shameless brats, Lucas screeched. Suddenly his hand flashed into the basket and he threw the wriggling snakes at them. The boys screamed with terror. They all ducked at once, and luckily the knot of snakes flew over their heads. A single snake became detached from the rest. It hit Flavius in the face, bounced off, and fell to the floor where it wriggled right side up, raised its head, and hissed at the boy. Flavius almost fainted with shock, but seeing his friends making their escape from the room, he uttered a piercing cry for help and flew after them. As if pursued by the Furies, they raced down the long corridor, squeezed through the two doors in a body, and ran down Broad Street almost all the way to the Forum. They did not stop until they reached a public fountain, where they greedily drank the cool, clear water flowing from the mouth of a stone lion. Gradually, they grew calmer. Finally, Julius said, panting, I guess Lucas took a dislike to us. We escaped death by a hair, Antonio said. Magician or not, he has no right to throw snakes at people, Publius complained. They must have been poisonous, Antonio said, leaning over the edge of the fountain for another drink. But suddenly he straightened up with a cry of anguish. Oh, help! A snake has bitten me! Help! He writhed and twisted convulsively while the others stood helplessly around him. Suddenly, something fell to the pavement with a ringing sound. It was the dagger he had hidden. During their wild flight, it had slipped down under his toga, and as he stooped over, it had pricked him in the stomach. Publius and Julius roared with laughter. Antonius, too, was enormously relieved and able to appreciate the joke. Flavius alone remained silent. He could still feel the horror of the damp, cold, slimy snake on his face. Where is Mucius anyway? Publius asked, looking around in surprise. There was no sign of Mucius. It was already dark and the streets were almost deserted. A gust of wind whipped up a billow of dust in front of them. Thunder boomed in the distance. I don't understand that, Julius said uneasily. Where can he be? Probably he ran first, before we did, and went right on home, Publius said. That isn't like him, said Julius. He's never been the first to run away. And besides, he has our money with him. He thought maybe we would fool around and he wouldn't get home on time, Flavius said. His father is very strict with him about that. This seemed convincing, but the others still felt queer about Mucius's absence. However, they did not have time to think much more about it. A brilliant streak of lightning flashed across the sky, followed by ear-splitting thunder. Immediately afterward, a fearful shower of hail began pounding down upon them. "We'd better get home," Publius shouted. He tucked up his toga and began running with great leaps down the street. The others followed him at top speed. Chapter 12, A River Inside a Building. Mucius had not separated from the others because he was in a hurry to get home. He had not even run away when they had. He stayed with Lucas, for he had made an astonishing discovery. After handing the chain to Julius, he had gone to the rear of the group. Standing there, more or less inconspicuous, he had taken the opportunity to look around the place. He was curious to find out how Lucas had made the iron-bound door open without himself leaving the vaulted room. Close to the floor, along the wall, Mucius discovered several cords. "Aha," he thought, "that's the trick." Then his eyes fell on a woolen cloak, lying half hidden behind a pillar near the fireplace. He was startled, for the cloak seemed familiar to him. While Julius was talking, he stole over to it, lifted it, and examined it closely. Sure enough, it was Rufus's cloak. On the left shoulder was the neatly mended tear which Mucius had seen before. Here were clear proof that Rufus must have visited Lucas. But why? And why had he left his cloak behind? Puzzling over this, he paid no attention to the way the interview was going. Then suddenly he heard Lucas's shout and saw his friends fleeing wildly. He hesitated for a moment, and that was his mistake. For by the time he began running after them, he was several yards behind. He raced into the corridor and found the inner door with the secret mechanism already shut. The others must have slammed it as they rushed out. He shook it, pounded his fist against it, but his friends did not hear. This was a pretty mess. He was caught like a mouse in a trap. It was so dark that he could not even see the walls of the passageway. The only light was the greenish sheen from the mask behind the pane of yellow glass. He looked at his hands and saw that they were shaking, and found to his surprise that he still was clutching Rufus's cloak. He was scared. His heart was pounding so loud he thought he could hear it. "Ridiculous," he told himself. "He can't do anything to me." But he was afraid of Lucas. Should he ask the soothsayer to let him out? He tiptoed back to the curtain and peered through it. Lucas was going around with a basket, picking up something. He moved in a peculiarly awkward fashion, and every step he took sounded as though he were pounding a block of wood against the floor. Stooping seemed hard for him, too, for he groaned aloud each time he bent his back. With a shudder, Mucius saw that the floor of the room was crawling with snakes. He backed into the corridor. As he groped along the walls, he felt a ladder under his hands. Quickly, he put on Rufus's cloak and lifted his foot to the lowest rung. It was a long climb before his head bumped against something hard. He felt what was above him and realized that it was a ceiling trapdoor. When he braced himself against the ladder and pushed, it opened upward. Drops of rain pelted into his face. It was thundering and lightning, but this did not drive him back. He swung up onto the roof, quickly closed the trapdoor, and sat down upon it. Then he sighed with relief. He was out of that dreadful place. For a while he sat there feeling quite pleased with himself, but gradually he began to be uncomfortable. He could not very well sit out here on the roof all night long in the pouring rain, with the lightning flashing all around him. Maybe I can jump off, he thought. Luckily, the roof did not have a sharp pitch. He crawled on hands and knees to the edge and waited for a flash of lightning. Then he looked down, and with a shudder started back. The building was far too high for him to venture a jump. He would break every bone in his body. Now he crawled along the edge of the roof, hoping to find a rain gutter on which he might shinny down. But this hope failed. There were no gutters. He made himself as small as he could, hunched up against the driving rain, and stared despairingly into the darkness. But suddenly he sat bolt upright. By the latest lightning flash, he had caught a glimpse of the flat roof of another house, almost within reach. The distance between the two roofs was hardly longer than the length of his arm. Immediately, he crawled down to the edge and prepared to jump. At the next lightning flash, he leaped, fell forward on his face, but he was safe. He would certainly find another trap door on this roof, and he made up his mind to rouse the people who lived in the house and ask them to let him out. They would be strangers, but they certainly could not be as bad as Lucas. But how could he account for the fact that he was stranded on their roof? I'll simply tell them the truth, he decided. Cautiously, he crawled forward, but suddenly his hands reached out into empty space. He lost his balance and fell head first into space. It's all over, was his last thought. The fall will kill me. Then he dropped with a loud splash into water and sank like a stone. Mucius was a good swimmer, and with a few vigorous strokes he brought himself quickly to the surface. It was pitch dark. He could see nothing at all. Water had gotten to his nose, and his head rang as though 1,000 pins were sticking into his brain. Rufus's cloak felt as heavy as iron on his back, and he had to keep treading water vigorously to stay on the surface. He had not the faintest idea where he could be. He must have fallen into a river, for he could feel a strong current under his feet. But how was that possible? The Tiber was at least half a mile away from here, and there was no other river near. Perhaps I am dead, he thought, in sudden terror. Perhaps I am swimming in the river Styx, which leads to Hades. But that was really too fantastic. The dead were supposed to wait nicely on the shore until Charon took them across the Styx in his ferry. Besides, you didn't feel sick to your stomach when you were dead, and he certainly was feeling badly from all the water he had swallowed. Suddenly he realized that it was no longer raining, although it had just been pouring cats and dogs, and that the wind had stopped completely also. But he still heard the rain beating down high above his head. He gazed upward, and for a second, by a flash of lightning, caught sight of the sky framed in a square opening. No doubt about it, there was a roof above him, with a skylight through which he must have fallen. He was inside the house next door. But then how could there be a river inside a house? How strange. Growing tired of treading water, he let the current carry him along, and in a short time came up against a smooth wall. It felt like marble. Then he felt ground underfoot and realized with delight that the depth of the water was rapidly dropping. Soon it reached only to his waist, and before long was gurgling harmlessly around his ankles. He waded along the wall, stumbled upon a flight of stone stairs, climbed up and sat down exhausted on the top step. He felt altogether done in, and so weary that he could not frame a single clear thought. If only he could figure out where he was. He cursed the darkness. Because he could not see, he did not dare move from his place, for fear of falling again. But suddenly, he burst into laughter. In a flash, he had realized where he was. He had fallen into the baths of Diana, right into the swimming pool. What a joke! He knew these baths very well. They were an elegant place of recreation for rich patricians, and he had often been here with his father. He had never known that the building was located directly back of Lucas's place. How often he had happily swam in this very pool into which he had just fallen so unexpectedly. At this point, he realized what enormous luck he had had. The water of the baths was drained out every night. That was the reason for the powerful current. If he had tumbled in here only a little later, he would have broken his neck on the marble floor of the pool. He jumped to his feet and groped around until he found the front entrance, but the doors were firmly locked, and there was no other exit that he knew. Here he was, locked in for the second time, and there was no help for it. He would have to wait all night until he was let out. He was soaking wet, too, but at least he was not sitting on a roof in the rain. He found a marble bench, folded Rufus's cloak into a pillow, stretched out, and fell asleep at once. All right, see you next time.